Hi everyone, welcome to this lecture on regionalism and social realism, a relatively short lecture, frankly, because some of the ideas aren't all that complex and other ideas are things that you've already covered to some degree. Regionalism and social realism are the names of two major styles. And these are styles that, again, the terms were developed actually by critics in the first place for regionalism. And then for social realism, that was a label primarily developed by a major artist that we'll be looking at, Ben Shahn. They're really kind of antithetical movements in a way. They both are interested in social issues to some degree, but regionalism is primarily interested in sustaining the status quo, in projecting a vision, kind of like Norman Rockwell vision, of heartland value America as the identity of America, as our national kind of identity, whereas social realism is much more interested in pointing to some of the problems that exist in the United States during their time period of the 1930s into the 50s, rather than projecting this kind of ideal image of what America aspires to be. And I'm going to go at this in a little bit more detail here. But first, let's talk about the context. Particularly starting off, we're going to look at of regionalism first. So you're looking at the cover of Time magazine here with on the cover Thomas Hart Benton. Thomas Hart Benton is without question the most important artist associated with American regionalism. He was the son of a Missouri senator. He was someone who taught at the Art Students League for quite a while, including having as one of his students Jackson Pollock, who we'll see coming up in a future module in the next lecture, actually. And he was a major spokesperson for regionalism. Regionalism is an extension of kind of, you want to say, American genre painting. It's very figurative, it's very understandable, and that's part of its appeal during this time period. The context for me is entirely essential to understanding why this movement got so important or popular during the time that it did. You see, it rises in popularity coextensive with the rise, or frankly the fall, of America into the Great Depression. And so again, you're going to be looking at works that are basically late 20s all the way through the 30s into the even early 40s. This is the time of the Great Depression, which of course starts in 29 and continues all the way up until World War II, when the kind of war boom economy finally shakes us out of that major slump. Now during the time period, remember, abstraction in the United States was always something that was greeted with a great degree of skepticism. And one of the reasons that I gave you the reading by Thomas Craven, and here you have a portrait of Thomas Craven by Thomas Hart Benton, who these two were actually college roommates. This critic who talked about, frankly, dismantled from a number of different standpoints modernism, or modern interest in abstraction, particularly European artists, and promoted the work of his former college roommate and the regionalists, has to do with a lot of people believing that abstraction was very closely associated with European values in particular. And if you see the common thread in Thomas Craven's criticism, he talks about these modern art movements and their transplanting of these modern art movements to the United States as coming from foreign soil, not able to prosper in the United States, primarily on this one ground. Over and again, he keeps saying that abstraction basically is the product of one individual idiosyncratic mind, right? And yes, let's say someone like Van Gogh or Cezanne might have certain degrees of genius to them, but basically what they're doing is they're expressing something of their inner psyche on the canvas. And the question for Craven and many other people is, what use is this to anyone else? Sure, it might be interesting, sure, it might be fashionable, but really, if that's just the product of one individual mind, and I can't quite align myself with that particular, and oftentimes you'll hear Craven say kind of crazy point of view, then what use is it to the larger society? And that, of course, we've seen frequently in this class was a big thing on the minds of a lot of artists. How does my art project an image of what America should aspire to be, or give representation to our common idea of national identity, or what have you? And what the regionalists were trying to do was to promote a very, what they thought of as an indigenous American type of art, an art that was a manifestation of the United States' own national identity that corresponded with the things that we really took to be deeply held American values. And we'll see what they meant by that, by the way, in a moment here. But in any case, it gets popular because during the time of the Great Depression, there was a great inward turn. The United States, after going through and getting into, by the way, World War I pretty late, after going through this cycle of great prosperity through the Roaring '20s and then that financial collapse of the Great Depression in '29 and going all the way through the '30s, we blamed a lot of that on our attachment to Europe, on our paying attention to someone else's problems. As a matter of fact, there are some pretty scary parallels to me anyway about what's going on today in terms of the populist rhetoric that we hear coming out of the White House and the things that were going on, at least in the kind of large, not out of the White House, by the way, in the 1920s, but out of other parts of the population in the 1920s into the 30s about, foreign influences and keeping them out and really America first kind of rhetoric. So this xenophobia that develops in the 1920s has a counterpart to it. If we're afraid of the other, and in this case it's primarily immigration still, because they're going to take our jobs, but even more importantly, any kind of ties to Europe. We need to focus on ourselves, so goes the rhetoric. Then the other side of this is, what is truly American? What is naturally or implicitly American? What is our essential characteristic? What do we stand for? What are our values? In other words, what should our art form look like? And the answer that the regionalists gave during this time is, and you'll see this, it's representational, oftentimes with a degree of naturalism, right? It's something that we can all recognize. It's democratic in the sense that anyone can make sense of it. You don't have to have some kind of special understanding of formalism in terms of aesthetic theory. You don't have to know anything about the effects of lines. You don't need to, cultivate a knowledge of art in order to understand regionalist aesthetics. It's just straightforward, so they said. And of course, it has a very American subject matter, right? So the stories that they're telling are heartland value stories full of you'll see it, ideas about what America is and should be that go way back. So again, it's going to be an aesthetic that is easily understandable to anyone, thus democratic, and it's going to represent American subjects, or supposedly American subjects. It's a particular kind of subject, let's say, that everyone gets and that bond us all together as a community rather than being the products of an idiosyncratic mind. And again, Thomas Craven here would say over and again in that reading that you were asked to read, here's what's wrong with this European artist or another. And he's fairly nice about it in this essay. It might not seem like it, because really he's not talking about the larger problem that he sees involved, which is, it's okay if those weird Europeans are doing what they're doing. The problem is when American artists, such as those we looked at in the modernist lecture, try to emulate those. And then what they're doing is basically coming at the question of art from the idiosyncrasies of their own individual minds, turning us all into a fragmented society of a cacophony of different languages being spoken, and we're never going to get to something that unifies us all together, which supposedly is what regionalism is supposed to do. The other thing that supports regionalism, frankly, is that during the Great Depression, Franklin Delano Roosevelt starts the Works Progress Administration, which I talked about in the last lecture, which is a big governmental funded program in order to put American workers back to work. Much of this has to do with infrastructure rebuilding and so forth. And, it's successful. It also has an arm to it that is devoted to the arts. And the big one is what's known as the Federal Arts Project. Now, the WPA and Federal Arts Project together oftentimes foster, through patronage, the painting of murals in public buildings, primarily, although not exclusively, governmental buildings. And we even have one at the University of Washington, still in Kane Hall. These go up in post offices, governmental buildings, Capitol buildings, and so forth. And if you think about what kind of painting will go up in a public place, it really has to follow some of the, or at least at the time they thought, follow some of the aesthetic rules that regionalism puts in place. It needs to be a subject that people can agree with, that has something to do with a larger community, thus not something esoteric or individualistic or even critical of society, frankly. And in order, frankly, and this happens even today, to not anger people, it needs to be something that when someone looks at, anyone understands. In other words, it has to have an appeal to a mass audience rather than any kind of individual audience. And so if you think of the WPA program, and none of the artists we're looking at actually really worked in that because they're all highly successful, but many artists that were producing works like them did, as supporting the same kind of aesthetic presumptions that someone like Benton or Curry or Grant Wood would have as well, then you see one of the other reasons that this becomes popular at the time. So what are we talking about here? What do these works look like? This is a work by Thomas Hart Benton called Boomtown from 1928. And if I were to ask you in a formal prompt, something like, how does this work represent ideas that we actually saw in American 19th century landscape painting, I hope you would get it. It's just an updating of that, and it's a close-up of things that you saw, for instance, in Asher Duran's Progress, or you even saw, to some degree, on the pediment of Thomas Crawford's The Progress of Civilization, and that idea of progress is at the root of this. In this case, 1928, so right on the verge of the Great Depression, but we're not there yet. What Thomas Hart Benton is picturing is the prospering of a small town that's turning into a bigger town. They've got in the background that billowing smoke back there. This isn't a bad thing. This is a good thing. This is someone burning oil or burning coal, putting it to use to power big power lines or oil rigs that you see back here in the background in order to, again, make use of those natural resources that purportedly God has given us so that we can prosper. Then you see telegraph poles, telephone poles, right? Power lines coming in one way or the other. These are all signs of technological progress. The town is booming. Also with that, you see signs that the town is booming in terms of them having their first theater and their first hotel here, and even automobiles are showing up amidst all of the trappings of things that maybe, let's say, a decade before would have been covered wagons and so forth. So what we're basically seeing is an updating of ideas from the 19th century. Making use of those natural resources allows these small towns to boom and get better and stronger, and this is what America's all about, right? It's also pitched to us in a language that is really understandable. Naturalism, right? This isn't a realistic scene of anything. It's a naturalistic scene of a make-believe area, but it's convincing in that we can imagine something like this occurring and we can recognize everything in this picture. So again, according to regionalism, this is quite democratic. You don't need to have any special esoteric knowledge about art to look at this and understand it, and that is associated with American values too. This one's a fun one. This is one of a series of 4 paintings on the arts of, in this case, this is the arts of the West. It was a mural, so a big wall painting. And then we'll see the arts of the South, and they also had arts of the North and arts of the East as well. So it's a 4-part panel mural painting. And I just want to, again, just pause for a minute and kind of look at what he's saying are the arts of the West, right? This is very, very American. It's supposed to be, on the one hand, saying American arts are oftentimes overlooked by Europeans as not arts at all, that there's something else, right? That an art is something that is associated with high culture, people who are elitist, frankly, Thomas Hart Benton would say. Remember, he actually calls himself an enemy of modernism, right? He's fighting against that and all that it brings with it through elitism, through making itself sound better or bigger or more important than it actually is. And he's promoting this idea that all of these other things that Americans are exceptional at, but are not recognized as art forms, actually should be considered art forms. I like to say, when I'm doing this class face-to-face, make this little exercise where look at all the activities that are going on here and then imagine what the European version of this might be as an art form, because I think that's in the back of his mind here. So, for instance, is over here on the right-hand side, you have people wrangling horses, like rodeoing or so forth. And if you've ever seen people do this, it's extraordinary, right? What they're able to do, it's absolutely an art form, but we wouldn't think of it as an art form in the same way that high painting is. Benton's saying, yes, it is. It takes all of this skill. You have to know those horses inside and out. It takes a lifetime of practice. Why wouldn't we call this art? But on the other hand, if you're a European and you're kind of snobbish about this, what would the European equivalent be? When it comes to horses, something like dressage, right? Something quite fancy, make those horses do things that they have no reason to do, right? Train them to do things that have absolutely no practical purpose, whereas Americans, of course, have a different version. In the foreground, another art form, right? Playing cards. Again, people who are good at cards obviously spend their life kind of figuring this out, knowing the odds, knowing how to read their fellow players. Makes sense that if you think of art as something that's cultivating a special degree of skill in something, of course cards could be in there. What kind of cards do we think they're playing? Well, almost assuredly some kind of poker, right? A very straightforward American game. And then you think a little bit about, okay, what would the European counterpoint to this be? Well, it'd be some fancy pants game like bridge or who knows, that no one else knows how to play these days. Shooting guns right in the center. Man, it's always been this way. I don't want to make anyone anger. I don't want to get on anyone's nerves here with my own soapbox, but America and our guns. And I grew up on a farm. I own guns. I've hunted before. I mean, it's not like I'm unaware of the utility of guns, and I don't have any problem with that. But America's always been very closely associated with guns for whatever reason. And here you have someone who is an expert shot. If you think about what would be going on in Europe at the same time period, right, it wouldn't be someone who is dressed in kind of wrangling clothes out there hunting. It might be someone target shooting or skeet shooting or something of that sort. In the background, horseshoeing, another art form. You ever get in the way of an old guy throwing horseshoes, he'll cuss you out there because take it pretty seriously. What's the European counterpoint? Something like boules, right? Something like bocce balls or something of that sort. In the foreground, what's another art form here you see are, you can actually hear them playing. Someone guitar picking, someone fiddling, and someone playing the harmonica. Right? You can hear that sound. That is conceived by Benton to be an American indigenous art form. Imagine the European equivalent. It's something like chamber music. And instead of course, shipping champagne like someone might be in a chamber orchestra, we're having our good old moonshine here. Or right behind them, dancing to that music. Line dancing or square dancing, something of that sort. Imagine the European equivalent, something like ballet. Now, along with a very, again, as he thinks of it, indigenous American art form, by which he means something that's kind of a homegrown, white, middle American art series of art forms, even if it's set in the South. You have a language of the art that is supposed to be quite democratic because it is understandable by all of us. Now, the spatial system that he set up here makes zero sense, right? How can you have rodeoing right over here and then horseshoeing over here and so forth? But that has something to do with he's putting this on a mural and he's pressed for space. So he just puts them all into these little zones and says, this is a art of the West, this is an art of the West, and so forth. Besides that, it's totally understandable. You know exactly what they're doing. You know exactly what they're feeling. It's something that's understandable by all. And therefore, at least for the regionalists, isn't something combating European imports of modernism. I just want to show you a few more of these a little bit more quickly. So arts of the South. What do you have as arts of the South? Well, preaching, religiosity, singing in the choir, right? Plowing the fields. Or if you go up into, this one's called Activities in the City, from a series of murals called America Today from the early 30s. You see the activities of the city, right? Dancing, kind of burlesque dancing, some forms of preaching, lots of business activities, riding the subway, boxing, and kissing on the benches and so forth. This is what his world looks like. That's what he's saying. This is America today. Or if you go to the South, you can see him extolling the virtues of the simple pastoral life. This one's called cotton pickers, right? So people still doing, practicing the industry that, or one of the two industries, the crops that made America prosper, at least when it came to the Southern economy. He still has some black people in here because, believe it or not, even though a lot of this art is quite clearly kind of focused on white American values, Thomas Hart Benton didn't shy away from showing some of the sullied history of the United States. So he's not, you can see the black workers here off to the background. He's not adverse to showing you that some people are still stuck in this industry and making that reference back to the fact that this is an industry that prospered originally because of black slavery, and then because of black slavery plus the cotton gin here. Again, typical American scene of something that is seen, at least in the American consciousness of the time, as part of our national identity, a very important agricultural crop for the prospering of the United States. People still toiling away at this. But it doesn't really show you anything of the reality. Remember, this is the time of the Great Dust Bowl. This is the time of grapes of wrath. This is the time when farm workers were dying off in droves because they couldn't, continue their industries. And none of that's being shown. Instead, it's this kind of, again, Rockwellian version of America in which even in difficulty, we all are still enduring. Again, he did a lot of murals, meaning paintings on walls, such as this one called Coal from 1930, but he wasn't really part of the WPA program proper. He got his funding outside of that source. And here I'm just giving a counterpoint to, if that cotton pickings in the South, what's going on in other parts of the United States that are more associated with, again, extracting those natural resources and putting them to use so that America can prosper. Well, the coal industry. And again, he doesn't show you all the pitfalls of the coal industry or its impact on the workers or exploitation. Instead, what he shows you is how, of course, this goes into this hard working, very heroic, kind of, monumental figure, strong white American figure is helping to mine the coal, taking it out of the mountains so as to, and this is a coal village, so as to lend to the prosperity of the growth of factories, particularly on the eastern seaboard, in an effort for America to progress, which has been an age-old idea as we've seen. I just want to show you one of these. This is a series of murals that is part of the Missouri State House, and this is a scene called Pioneer Days, just to give you an idea of some of his more complex works. And again, I'm just going to go through this fairly quickly. What he's doing is in the Missouri State House, he created all of these murals on the walls over the course of a summer that basically show the history of Missouri. And it starts way back over here where the French settlers are treating with the American Indians so as to trade and start colonization efforts. So he shows that starting off. He also shows, and again doesn't shy away from it, the American trader getting the Native American hooked on alcohol, which of course they were quite unused to, in order to trick him out of trading for furs that were a lot more valuable. On the other side of this, over on the right-hand side, you see people hard at work in the industry of, again, blacksmithing, and building a kind of community of blacks and whites now working together. But he doesn't shy away from showing you in the background here, background down here below, the way that blacks were actually treated. This is a tarring and feathering of black people in some of the racial wars that occurred in this part of the world. Over here, by the way, he's again not afraid to shy away from things like this is the way that the Mormons were treated. There was a huge expulsion of the Mormons from Missouri that led to a lot of executions, or started with a lot of executions over here. Again, a language we can all understand. We can get what's going on here, telling the history of Missouri in this case. By the way, in the center, if you didn't quite get to this, let me get you in close so you can see this. This is Huckleberry Finn, or Tom Sawyer, right? So we've got Jim, and we've got Huck, and we've got in the background a steamboat on the Missouri River, where a lot of this story takes place, called the Sam Clemens, for Samuel Clemens or Mark Twain, which was his pen name, of course. So, again, those are big murals, kind of major works. He continues to work all the way through the 1940s, even though in the 40s, as we'll see, American interest turned away from this kind of regionalism and back towards abstraction. He painted scenes such as this. This is the music lesson. And if it looks roughly familiar to our last lecture, it is. It's just, frankly, kind of the white version. Now, the simple, meaning, not very prosperous, very happy with a kind of simple blue-collar life, father teaching his daughter how to play a guitar. This kind of aesthetic turns up over and again at this time. So another artist associated with this time period and with this movement called Regionalism is John Stuart Curry. This is his Baptism in Kansas from 1928. Again, heartland American values that are supposed to be what America aspires to, or represent kind of the core values of an American culture. And here we have it. It's a baptism, obviously, in Kansas, so a kind of Midwest values here, where you've got everyone in here, by the way, is white. Where you've got a preacher baptizing various converts to Christianity, not in a fancy, Catholic or even kind of church-based baptismal font. They're doing it right outside in the watering trough, right? This is like a small community doing it the simple, old-fashioned way, with the entire community showing up to witness this conversion because it's so important. The entire community and the of course, compositional format of this is arranged around a circle. The circle is an age-old, of course, symbol of community or connectedness of all people. They're singing, they're in support, and then up above you see a weather vane. That weather vane draws our attention. Again, the circle here mimicking the circle of the composition down below. It brings our attention up into the clouds, and you see the top of the weather vane pointing towards this cloud where you have two birds here, or symbols of God witnessing the whole thing above. It's worth mentioning as well that this giant structure of the barn in the background is meant to recall for audiences European versions of this, where in the background you'd have a soaring cathedral. And it's as if Curry is saying something like, our true cathedrals are these giant barns, which are huge monumental architectures to Again, us using that land that God has given us, that old manifest destiny idea, in order to prosper. You see, you wouldn't put a big church here because remember, as I said way back with Thomas Cole, Americans were really averse to the idea of big church. They wanted little community religious groups. Or one more of these kind of typical, right? This is John Stuart Curry's tornado over Kansas. Again, in Kansas, even though most of these painters, even though they might have come from the Midwest or the South, will be painting out of New York for New York audiences. And not just New York, of course, but you get my drift there. East Coast urban audiences. And in this case, you've got a natural disaster coming. Remember how I said way back in the 19th century that the pioneer was someone who struggled with and against nature, and through his own ingenuity and bravery would prosper despite all the difficulties put in his way. Well, this is just another version of this. Here comes the twister. It's bearing down on them. The big, of course, once again, white, all-American, husband is leading the family into the bomb shelter. He is the leader. The wife is kind of looking to him for support, getting everyone in there, including all of the animals that you can gather up before that twister comes, right? So the American hero, a kind of latter-day version of the pioneer, so to speak. One of the iconic images, of course, of regionalism comes from Grant Wood. This is Grant Wood's famous American Gothic, and I bet you everyone's seen this before. So regionalism, again, really understandable heartland values. In this case, a lot of people mistake what's going on here. They're not husband and wife. The way that he conceived it anyway is that that's the dad and that's his daughter. And so you are set up in this viewing dynamic as her potential suitor. So you're coming to ask the father to take out the daughter. The father looks directly at you, man of no nonsense, with his pitchfork in his hand. I used to always kid my daughter that I was going to set up a pitchfork in our living room for just the occasion of her first date. She didn't think it was funny either. And the daughter demurely looks away, waiting for father's approval this way or that. They're very staid, right? They're very religious. They are, of course, nothing happens without dad saying yes, and then one imagines it's a quite non-risque date in the first place. The way that this gets its name is the American Gothic style or Craftsman Gothic style architecture that you see in the background. So the Gothic arch itself, for those of you who don't know, of course, was a feat of engineering that allowed the cathedrals to be built higher and higher by taking the weight that's above that, pushing it out to the side. So it's very closely associated with Christianity. But of course, we don't want giant churches in the United States. So we take that architectural element, which, by the way, here has zero function, doesn't do anything when it comes to the structure of this, and we use it to basically symbolize the religiosity of these two figures. The counterpoint to this, just very briefly, was a movement known as social realism that was promoted by a man who was a photographer using his art for social causes, whether it be photography or painting, and a writer. This is Ben Shon's The Passion of Sacco and Vanzetti from 1931-32, and it references an international catastrophe, frankly, that happened in the United States that showed the inequities in the judicial system in particular. Sacco and Vanzetti were two Italian immigrants who were also avowed anarchists. This was just a kind of social position. And today we have a lot of people who are basically anarchists too, or extreme libertarians who think that, government's in their way all the time. In any case, the point is not to defend this way or that, but rather to say that these two men were fingered for a crime that they absolutely did not commit, a robbery gone wrong in which people were killed. And these two were pointed out because they had They were immigrants, and they were anarchists. So these are two major strikes against them. They were kind of railroaded into being convicted of this crime with minimal, of course, evidence for it. After they were convicted, there was plenty of evidence that someone else did it. In fact, someone else confessed. But because of the way that the judicial system was set up, over and over again, they were either denied appeals or their appeals would go through, but only their motions would be denied. And eventually, they were executed for a crime most people think that they didn't commit, almost assuredly didn't commit. It became international news, of course, and it was the first time in the United States at a large scale that discussions about the propriety of capital punishment were talked about. And of course, most of Europe was saying, they had outlawed this years before because of their own problems, frankly, with it. Were weighing in and saying we shouldn't be doing this. It's very savage, backwards, and so forth. And there's a gross possibility of the miscarriage of justice. In this case, again, Ben Shahn is in some ways drawing attention to the same types of interests that the regionalists had. This is pretty understandable language, right? You see Sacco and Vanzetti here in the center, and then you see the protesters off at one side, and then you see the judges over on the other side, these are all portraits of the various judges who either denied appeals or denied motions that led to them to be executed. Next to them, you see the caskets of Sacco and Vanzetti. And the judges professing some degree of remorse over this, but obviously not enough. In the background, another judge kind of witnessing the scene from afar, but not willing to get his hands dirty. And down here below, in a much smaller form, in order to emphasize the idea that he had no power, is the defense attorneys for these two men. So a big difference here, of course, is that someone who is associated with social realism wants to make the United States better by pointing out some of our flaws. The regionalists tend not to point out our flaws, or if they do, they're couched way back there in history, and instead just kind of promote this vision of the United States as set around these core values of Christianity, simplicity, hard work, prosperity, progress, and so forth. In fact, one of my favorite works by Ben Shahn is a counterpoint to one of the works that I showed you by Thomas Hart Benton. This is his work called Miners' Wives, and it's from 1948. Of course, the coal industry, which has been around forever, some of you know, if you look this up anywhere, you'll find out, it has not been good to workers since the very start. It's an incredibly dangerous job to be in. If a mine doesn't collapse on you, black lung is surely going to get you. You work away as hard as you can, generation after generation, and barely get ahead. Now, someone like, let me just cut over here, someone like Benton is really pulling on the heartstrings of Americans who see this as really back-breaking labor that one generation after another generation has done, that has supported the growth of the United States. And today, you hear Donald Trump, and you knew this going into his election, really promoting the idea of, I'm going to get coal workers back to work. And maybe if you don't come from this part of the world, you have no clue why this is appealing at all. After all, this is an industry that, at least in my opinion, is bound not to be around in another 30 years. It's just not the way forward for a million different reasons. And it's never been particularly good to the workers anyway. But, proud Americans are really proud of the fact that they worked really hard and they're just blue-collar people building a life for themselves. And that life has also helped the United States at large. And they tend to emphasize or think of this as part of their identity. And so when someone craps on this, they take it really personally. Now, someone like Ben Shahn, however, comes to it from the other standpoint, which is to say we really need to focus on the human impact of, a corporation or series of corporations which is set up to maximize its profits and has very little regard, or at least not enough safety in place to take care of its workers. I can't believe today, but it's like once a year, if you keep your eye on international news, that you'll have some huge mining incident, either in the United States or elsewhere. Or if you look into the reports of people who are still dying of things like lung disease because of this, you know, it's still happening today. So what Ben Shahn does here is he shows the human impact on the wife. The wife in the foreground here, her mother, one presumes, so the grandmother in the background now, needing to take care of the child because mom is so despondent after the death of her husband, who is referenced only here by his hanging coat. You know, he's no longer around, he's been killed. And what we get in this narrative is it's as if these two executives from the mining industry have stopped by to tell the wife that her husband is dead, and now they're on their way back to the factory in the background, kind of having washed their hands of the whole situation. But we get left with, of course, the impact on the wife and the larger family. Now, Ben Shahn, as you see, is interested in modernist ideas of abstraction, and in particular here, expressionism, right? So he's changed or exaggerated things like the redness of the brick in the background to be really powerful red, kind of intense red. He's made the dress of this, whatever she's wearing, the dress of her multicolored, kind of shifting in colors. And what happens when our eye can't say all at once, this is what that is, right? If I can't look at that and say that's blue or that's red or that's yellow, and instead it's like it's a little bit this, it's a little bit that. So if you have lots of different things there, those are going to tend to provoke some kind of anxiety in us. They're harder for us to actually kind of digest or to consume. It also, though, picks up the same colors as the area around her, so she almost seems to be kind of floating in the ether, almost feels like she's a ghost-like figure. Not quite all there, and you see that pallor on her white face and her kind of despondent, wide-open eyes and the straightforward mouth here, lost in her grief. And then he, of course, has exaggerated the largeness of her hands, which are ringing here in the foreground, right, to really draw our attention to it. In other words, he tells the story through things that are recognizable, but then he manipulates the formal element so as to push that message as well through the formal elements and their effect on us too. And Ben Shahn didn't just do paintings, he did photography, and he did posters. So this is WPA Sunday, for instance, people sitting around waiting for work. In the background are their cheap tenement housing. He helped to promote the organization of labor. So you see a poster to help unite labor. And basically spent his life using his art as an instrument for social change. Part of that American tradition, frankly, in one way or another, of realism, although here realism in the service of kind of social values, which we saw perhaps last time when we were looking at the work of George Bellows and the Ashcan School. Well, that's it for this lecture. Next one, we go back into high modernist abstraction.